Being a journalist means in-depth analysis that unravels hidden truths, that question the status quo and fact-checks government.
These criminal elements hiding under the cloak of surveillance contractors are the APC elements.
Do you have facts to prove that? Being a journalist means waking up every day with a burning desire for peace, equity, and justice for all citizens.
We're being told that the choice you have is to take the lesser of two evils.
It means patriotism via the prism of objectivity and accountability. It means giving my platform to the masses to discuss issues that matter to them.
Some of them, if they bring budget, and the budget they lose. Some of them sleep. They're going to ask how much we are on. I have it.
Thereby shaping government policies and laws. My name is Osasu Igbinedion, and I am the People's Journalist.
Please join me in welcoming our guests from the United States, Nigeria, and Australia for our first conversation across time zones, a feat unto itself. I know you will enjoy.
Welcome to the Real Lives, Real Lessons session on the gendered response of leaders to the coronavirus pandemic. My name is Osasu Igbinedion, the Chief Executive Officer of Pan-African Television Network, located here in Abuja, Nigeria, TOS TV Network. I am delighted to be moderating today's session with two astute professionals, Prime Minister Gillard and Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the co-authors of Women and Leadership. Thank you so much for making time out of your very busy schedules to be here today.
Thank you, Osasu. Thank you.
You're most welcome. I'll start with you, Julia. A recent remark delivered by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, member of the U.S. House of Representatives, regarding sexism went viral. She echoed most of your 2012 speech, which was delivered at the Australian Parliament. What do you think is the role of media in reporting harassment and abuses meted out against female politicians and female leaders world over?
I think the media has an incredibly important role, and one of the things that continues to trouble me is not only that we see differential treatment of women in the media and harassment of women on social media, but it only gets called out to public attention periodically. So we get an event like AOC's remarkable speech, and then there's a flurry in the media, but then it goes back to business as usual. But actually, harassment is still happening then. I would want a world in which the media each and every day is calling out harassment of women, shining a bright white spotlight. So we have the debates we need to have to make sure that women in public life don't face this kind of filth and vitriol. And to give a sense of the dimensions, at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, where I chair at King's College London, we spend a lot of time studying representations of women in the media and harassment. We were very taken by an Amnesty International piece of work which studied a UK election and showed that over 40% of abusive tweets were directed at Diane Abbott, who was the first woman of colour to enter the House of Commons in the United Kingdom. So this is telling us not only is there harassment based on gender, but it intersects with race. And I'm really worried that in the forthcoming US election, we're going to get a real-time lesson in how bad this can be through the treatment of Vice Presidential candidate Kamala Harris. And I would just urge media to be on the job each and every day pointing this out.
Speaking about the upcoming US elections, leadership has shown that, it plays a critical role in dealing with issues, everyday issues, and also pandemics that spring out of nowhere. So the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us that leadership is important. So how important is female leadership in this pandemic era?
I think it's been very important, and I was drawn to a research report that came out a couple of days ago from 2 UK universities, and they've actually analysed now the 19 nations led by women against more than 190 nations overall. The fact that the statistic is 19 out of more than 190 should trouble us, shows us how few nations are led by women. But they've done quite a deep dive and shown that the nations led by women have had fewer deaths from the coronavirus, and that is because women tended to be quite risk averse and to lock their countries down quite early. So they took dramatic and early action to combat the transmission of the virus. So it's interesting to see that effectiveness of female leaders coming to the fore at a time like this. Now, I think we've got to take the next step and say, why is that? I'm not a believer that men and women's brains are different. And in fact, in the book, we spend a bit of time unpacking this, talking about neuroscience versus neurosexism. But what we do say in the book is that men and women have been socialised differently. We as voters tend to look for a distinctive style of female leadership. We want women to show strength and empathy. And when the world is feeling so bruised, so anxious as the pandemic continues to circle our globe, I do think that that's a style of leadership people are warming to. So it's leading us to a great discussion about the merits of women leaders in times of crisis. And I hope it leads us to a broader discussion about the merits of women's leadership at all times.
And speaking of that, women's leadership in times of crisis, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, you were finance minister here in Nigeria for 2 terms, and you brought the economy out of recession. Can you speak to me about the economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on women in particular? How does this affect our fight for the United Nations Global Goals for Sustainable Development, particularly goal number 5, gender equality?
Well, thank you, Osasu. The issue of the impact of the pandemic on women is a very important issue from different dimensions and depending on what part of the world you're in. But there's one thing that comes out, that women, many of the frontline workers are women. And so the nurses in hospitals in most countries are predominantly women. So these are the people whose lives are put at risk when they take care of people in the pandemic. We find that on the African continent, 75% of nurses are women. So that just shows you the kind of risks that they're exposed to. There's another dimension to this pandemic with respect to women, and that is, in fact, 2 more dimensions. One is gender-based violence. Many studies done by the UN has found that gender-based violence has increased in many parts of the world. You know, calls to hotlines by women who are being abused have significantly increased because in lockdowns there is nowhere to go and they're locked in with their abusive spouses. So this is a dimension that is very, very difficult and which governments have to pay attention to. And thirdly, on the economics of it, you also find that women are predominantly, they own small and medium enterprises, small business owners, and you can see that these are the businesses that have been very severely impacted during this pandemic. So many of them have had to close down. There are some women who have been very creative in taking their businesses online, making masks even, and selling them online. But these are not the majority. Many women, particularly in our part of the world, in developing countries, find that when there are lockdowns, they lose their livelihood. And this also impacts on their families and households. And lastly, education. Girls are very impacted by the lockdown. Children out of school, it's found that when it's time to return, many of the girls don't return in developing countries and may even be entered into marriage. So you can see from various dimensions that the pandemic has a big effect on women. And I think that we should look to the solutions. When we look to solutions to the pandemic, we must not forget to put women and youth at the center of the conversation. As Graça Machel, one of our iconic leaders on the continent, has said repeatedly, to bring the solutions to light, we must involve women, we must involve our youth. Thank you.
And that leads me to my follow-up question, Dr. Ngozi. How do we go about doing that? What are a few strategies that we could implement in ensuring that women and girls across the world are included in the solutions that are preferred by leaders in coming up with a recovery plan post-pandemic?
Well, I always say to people, because a lot of youth ask me, if you don't fight to be included, you will not be included. The same thing, I think if women are just sitting there and they don't fight to be included, then they won't have a voice. So I think we need to think of the strategies that can, force this inclusion. And one is through civil society. I mean, there are many women's groups who can give voice to the plight of women, the need for women to be included in decisions. They can also give voice to the fact that women have many solutions to some of the issues. It's not just about their problems, but the fact that they can bring solutions. So civil society has to be extremely active. And we have many women's groups. And so this is a time for them to come forward. I also think that women leaders need to speak up at this time and be that agent that can urge that women be included in the conversation. In many countries, you have professional women's groups as well. You have business women's groups. They too can have a voice and speak up. And of course, the politicians, like I said, whether they be in parliament or whether they be leaders, can also speak up and try to make sure the voices are heard.
Speaking up is definitely the first step, but being heard is another ball game. Julia, from your experience as Prime Minister in Australia, how did you make yourself heard? How did you scale through the ranks of power to become Prime Minister?
Well, it was a long journey for me personally, starting really in university days when I was first involved in protesting for change. So as Ngozi would say, raising my voice, getting involved, and that was about education funding. And I got a sense from that you could change the world if you got involved. And many, many years later, that led to an ambition to enter Parliament and then finally getting into Parliament. And when I was there, I focused obviously on the issues I was passionate about, tried to hone my skills as a politician, and over time won the support of my colleagues for ever increasing leadership roles. But I'm very conscious that when women look at my journey, what they would see is that I faced a lot of differential treatment because I was the first woman to leave in Australia. And, that has reinforced in me that we've all got to be on a mission to try and take the gendered, sexist, stereotyping treatment away from how we evaluate women leaders and just enable them to come through in equal numbers and to be fairly evaluated. And I think that starts with including women's voices in all of the community conversations that we have. One of the things about the current pandemic that troubles me is while we are seeing exemplary examples of women's leadership at president and prime ministerial level, at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, we've developed a tool to look at vast masses of text and to see whether women's voices are included. And when we did that on reporting about the coronavirus, we found that women's voices were disproportionately excluded. For example, political pieces around the coronavirus, women's voices were only 25% of the voices being heard. Well, when you've got that, degree of disproportionality at the start, who is included in the public conversation, it's no surprise that we continue to see up the power structures fewer and fewer women. So I think we've got to bust it open and get women involved equally, forcefully, clearly, at every level. And then we need to keep working on the very specific barriers for women in politics.
And I wonder, is your story the same with the other women who have held high positions of power that you interviewed for this book? You interviewed Theresa May, Mama Joyce, Banda, Jacinda Ardern, and many other powerful women. Did they share in their interviews also their strategies of, entering into these positions of power? Did they share with you, big lessons about addressing inclusion, in the political process? Because as I said, young women like myself, we speak and we speak very confidently, but getting those people in power to listen is a different ballgame. So what big lessons can we take away from this book? For the experience of those women who have been in power, what big lessons do they leave behind to inspire young women like myself? This question goes to the both of you.
Well, if I may start, I think a big lesson that came out for me from talking to these 8 incredible women leaders around the world is that while their individual journeys were different and their circumstances were different, we interviewed Ellen Johnson Sirleaf from Liberia. Obviously, her pathway to power was very different to Erna Solberg in Norway. And yet, with all of those differences in culture and context, there was much in common about the sexism they experienced as women leaders. So this, gendered treatment of women leaders is a global problem. It's everywhere. But each of them too talked about what they try to do now to expand networks, mentoring, sponsorship to include more women. So they are very focused on the change agenda, on bringing more women through. And that was true no matter what side of politics they came from. For example, a Conservative like Theresa May was also working to bring more women through. So I think that there is a use of power by women to change circumstances for the next generation. But the book reinforced in me we can't be naive about the dimension of the task. It's going to require the best efforts, the biggest mobilisation from all of us to ensure that we're in a world of equal leadership. And to leave you with one statistic, currently in our world, 70% of nations have never been led by a woman. Well, I want to live to see a day when you can look around the world and say half of the nations on earth are being led by women. And it's become so routine to see women like you step forward into leadership that we don't even have to have these conversations anymore, that the job is done. But that's going to require a great deal of force, and that's what I think inspires us and brings us together now.
Well, I think just to follow on to what Julia said, it's these 8 incredible women, and then looking at the lessons of Julian and myself, One of the striking things is that the learning and the struggling doesn't go away. Even when you're a leader, this is one thing we learned from the experience. There are still issues of every day you have to deal with in your experience. What do you wear and how do people look at that? This was something that women struggle with. The way that their appearance is looked at, their hair, how they worry about it. Hillary Clinton talking of spending so many hours on the issue of what her hair looked like. So the women, even in the topmost position, are treated a little differently with respect to their appearance. Julia got it right when she said, men have a uniform, it's the suit, and nobody looks at what they look like. Women don't, and they're subject to criticism. So it was interesting to me to find that. And you know what some of them did, or mostly all of them, develop a style. Like myself, I just developed a style and stuck to it. And then people get used to you in that style, and then they don't question. So many of them have done that. I think another thing that came through is just how incredibly hardworking these women were. And that's the other thing I want to say to all women. To get to leadership, it's not easy, but it can be done. But I won't lie to you, it entails a lot of hard work. Sometimes even when you're a leader, you may not even be heard. You may have to struggle with your fellow male leaders, as Ellen Johnson Sirleaf had to do sometimes, for your voice to be heard. So it's a continuing challenge, but to overcome it, you need a great deal of self-confidence. You have to believe in yourself and your mission. And the lesson from these women is that each one of them believed in their mission and their ability to change things. And so that's what I tell young women. You may not always be heard, but persevere. I can tell you myself that even till today, there are places I enter where I still have to project and struggle to be heard as a woman. Don't give up. That's the lesson we learned from all the women. Keep trying, and to make your voice heard, because it's important. And lastly, I think we need to talk about men. When we talk about women's leadership and women's voice and women's experiences, we often don't mention the men. But one of the things we did do in the book is to address some advice to men with respect to what they can do for women. And we encourage them, don't just be bystanders. You can also be agents for change. You can, when there's abuse of women, either online or in the media or whatever, you can raise your voice. Become the agent that tells people that this is not right and that we should correct it. You can be a mentor for women. And some of us have had incredible mentors who were men. I've had men as my mentors too, who helped me and advised me and opened doors. So women, you can also seek men as your mentors. Some of them can be incredibly supportive. We have the he-she movement of the United Nations, of Kumzile at the United Nations. She started it. And he for she is men who support women. So we should encourage that as well.
Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Prime Minister Julia Gillard, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Osasu. Thank you.
Being a journalist means in-depth analysis that unravels hidden truths, that question the status quo and fact-checks government.
These criminal elements hiding under the cloak of surveillance contractors are the APC elements.
Do you have facts to prove that? Being a journalist means waking up every day with a burning desire for peace, equity, and justice for all citizens.
with being told that the choice you have is to take the lesser of two evils.
It means patriotism via the prism of objectivity and accountability. It means giving my platform to the masses to discuss issues that matter to them.
Some of them, if they bring budget, the budget they look. Some they sleep. They're gonna ask how much we are on. I have it.
Thereby shaping government policies and laws. My name is Osasu Igbinedion, and I am the People's Journalist.